Hi guys, Blackbox here. Another tutorial, this time about the difference between the CFM and the IAE engines. Anybody flying the FSLabs A320 knows that you can choose between the CFM and the IAE engines. And so the question arises, what's actually the difference between the two engines, or what are the important differences? And that's exactly what I will highlight in this video. So let's get started with the CFM engines. Installed in the FSLabs A320 we have the CFM 56-5-B4. And you can also see that engine type in the MCDU under the data prompt. Now if my informations are correct, then this engine was actually certified in 1992. This engine consists of 5 low pressure compressor stages, then 9 high pressure compressor stages, and behind the combustion chamber you will find a single stage high pressure turbine, and then followed by a 4-stage low pressure turbine. The engine has a bypass ratio of about 6:1, meaning that 6 times more air goes around the engine than through the hot section, i.e. the combustion chamber of the engine. The engine produces about 120 kilonewtons of thrust, which equals to about 27,000 pounds of thrust. Alright, so let us now have a look at the IAE engines. And they have the serial number Victor 2527-A5. And again, you'll find this number in the MCDU under the data prompt. Now, this engine consists of a 4-stage low pressure compressor, followed by a 10-stage high pressure compressor, then the combustion chamber, and then followed by a 2-stage high pressure turbine, and the last part consists of a 5-stage low pressure turbine. The bypass ratio is 4.8:1, and the thrust rating is 26,600 pounds. However, there are some variants that even have a higher enhanced rating. One of the big differences you could just hear, the IAE engines have a very distinct roaring sound. Compare that to the CFM engines and you can hear that those sound a lot quieter. Right, let's now talk about some technical stuff. And first of all, I would like to talk about the N1 and the EPR indication. On the left you can see N1, and on the right you can see the engine indication from the IAE engines, and on the top line you can see the so-called engine pressure ratio. N1 is a simple indication of the low pressure shaft rotation speed, and that is also the speed of the fan of the engine. And since the fan produces most of the thrust, this is a very good indication for the pilots to see the power setting of an engine. And now on the right you can see the so-called EPR, engine pressure ratio. Now this indication also shows the pilots how much thrust is being produced. However, these numbers can be somewhat confusing. Like you can see here, the idle value is 1.005 and the flex takeoff power is 1.391. Now the engine pressure ratio is simply the turbine discharge pressure divided by the compressor inlet pressure. So in order to get the EPI ratio, you need sensors being installed in the compressor area and also in the turbine area. And the data from these two sensors are sent to a so-called differential pressure transducer. And this then indicates the ratio of the two pressures on the engine warning display. Now, practically, pilots usually have a couple of values that they remember by heart. For example, if you're flying a CFM engine around 60 tons landing weight, you would usually maybe require about 55% N1. And for the EPR, that indication would be around 1.06, 1.07. And those values are obviously for flaps full landing, and that also being on a 3-degree glide profile. Now, I don't want to get too deeply into the technical background of the EPR and N1 values. However, I would like to just explain a little bit what the EPR ratio has as an advantage. And the biggest advantage is simply that, for example, if you need 25,000 pounds of thrust, and that equals to a engine pressure ratio of 1.35, then it doesn't matter how old the engine is, what the state of the engine is. If you have an indication of an EPR of 1.35, then you know that the engine is actually delivering 25,000 pounds of thrust. Now, we said that the N1 indication is a very basic rotation speed indication, and hence you cannot really guarantee that the engine is actually producing, for example, those 25,000 pounds of thrust. Let me just explain that on a very simple basis. Let's say you are removing some of the fan blades and the rotation speed is, let's say, 85%. Because you're missing some fan blades, the engine doesn't obviously produce the thrust that it would produce with all the fan blades installed. Now with the EPR ratio, that is different because obviously when you have less fan blades, the pressure being produced will be less, and you would see this immediately by a drop in the EPR ratio. This would be the case, for example, when you have a bird strike. Let's say the bird damages some fan blades. Now, even though you still have the same rotation speed, i.e. the same N1 indication, the engine could be producing a lot less thrust. Now with the EPR ratio, like we said, if some fan blades were damaged and less pressure being produced, then you would have an immediate indication on the EPR scale. On the other side, you have to be aware that in order to get the EPR ratio, you are relying on probes being installed and maintained. These probes are subject to operation issues like icing, foreign object damage like insects, clogging the openings, etc., etc. And there was actually a pretty dramatic accident that happened where 737 lost altitude after takeoff and crashed into the Potomac River. And that was due to the results of the EPR probes being clogged by ice because they weren't heated. So the flight crew thought they had the proper EPR power setting. However, because the indication was wrong, they had a lot less thrust than expected. The N1 indication is derived by very simple means, and so the N1 indication is less susceptible to these kind of misreadings. Now, the Airbus, being a very clever aircraft, actually can sense some of the failures of the probes, and in those cases, the aircraft reverts into a so-called unrated N1 mode. And I'll show you this a little bit later on in this video. Now, I'm sure that some of you have noticed that the IAE engines also have an N1 indication on the engine warning display. And in the third line, you can actually see the dials there for N1. So if pilots just do not want to use EPR ratios, they can still have a look and fly according to N1 indication. Next, let's have a look at the so-called FADEC, the Full Authority Digital Engine Control Unit. The FADEC has the following functions. It does the engine control during the whole operational envelope. Then it has protections against engine exceeding its limits. It also transmits the engine parameters to various aircraft systems. And then it also has the detection, isolation, and the recording of failures. Now, like any other computer, the FADECs need constant electrical power supply. And that is why each FADEC has its own internal generator. Now, should for any reason the internal generator fail or produce no power because the engines aren't running, then of course there is a backup power available either via the battery bus or the DC2 bus. Now, whenever you see these amber crosses and amber dials on the engine warning display, you know that the FADEC at the moment is not powered or has powered down to save electricity and to protect it from overheating. So normally when the aircraft is first time powered on, the FADECs get powered for a couple of minutes and do their internal testing, and then after about 5 minutes they will switch off again, and then you will see these amber crosses. And for those who are so technically interested, the internal generator actually starts working when the N2 gets above about 12%. But there is another trick to get the FADECs powered on the ground, and this would be normally done when maintenance has to do some checks and needs to look at some engine parameters. Now, in order to get the FADECs powered, you just go way up to the overhead panel, and on the right hand side you see some black push button switches there. They are guarded, and then you only have to remove the cover and switch those buttons to on, and then you will see the engine instruments appear on the engine warning display. After you have looked at the instruments, made sure that everything's working fine, don't forget to switch those buttons off again. One more way to have the engine instruments displayed is of course when you're doing the engine start. So selecting ignition start will of course power the FADECs as well in order to be able to start the engines. Next we'll have a look at the difference during engine start. There is a very slight difference between the CFM and the IAE engines, and that I will show you now. So here we have the CFM engines, and we'll start engine number 2. On the lower display we can see that the engine start valve is opened, and immediately the N2 starts rotating, and about 15% we have ignition, and then at about 22-23% we will get fuel flow. Here we are, and shortly after that we have an EGT rise, and the N1 also starting to rotate. At about 50% N2 the ignition is switched off and the starter valve is closed, and so the engine now can run up by its own power and get up to its idle power. Now let's have a look at the IAE engines and their start behavior. So starting engine number 2, and again we see that the start valve is opened, and we very quickly get a increase in the N2 reading. But as you can see, the N1 readings aren't available yet. Also, you'll now notice that even though N2 reaches 25%, there is still no ignition and no fuel flow. And that is quite typical for the IAE engines, because they have a so-called cooling period, And that is because the IAE engines have a problem which is called a bowed rotor shaft, meaning that during cooldown the different cooling of the high pressure rotor causes it to bend or bow. And in order to have it straighten out, like I said, during the startup sequence, you'll have about 30 seconds of cooldown before fuel and ignition is added. And we can see engine is now reaching its idle power. Next, let's talk about the different thrust lever handling of the CFM and IAE engines. You can see me here setting 50% N1 on the CFM engine, and that correlates to a thrust lever angle. Well, I would say almost 50% between idle and the climb notch. So when flying manually with manual thrust, it's quite simple to get the thrust levers to about midpoint, and that means about 50% N1. Now that is somewhat different with the IAE engines. And again, I'm trying to set 50% N1. And then let's have a look at the position of the thrust levers. So here we get to 50% and have a look where the indication now is. I would say it's about 25% of the way between the 0 and the climb notch, i.e. the idle value and the climb notch position. And that makes flying and controlling the thrust with the IAE engines, especially in gusty wind conditions, somewhat more challenging, because in the thrust range from 0 to 50%, you have very small thrust lever angle changes to command almost 50% of the thrust range. And this phenomenon is also, of course, displayed on the EPR dials. You can see that at about 50% N1, the EPR needles barely make it out of the idle range. And so it is somewhat more difficult to quickly visually check the thrust setting on the EPR gauge. So typically, whenever you change the thrust lever position on an IAE engine, you always have to check the engine instruments to make sure that you are actually commanding the correct amount of thrust. It's somewhat different with the CFM. Here you have a better feel of the position of the thrust levers and don't have to check the power settings quite so often. So once again, in these two pictures, on the left side you have the CFM engines, on the right the IAE engines, and you can very clearly see the difference in the thrust lever angle in order to command 50% N1. As mentioned before, there could be a fault in the pressure pickup sensors or the temperature sensors which are required to calculate the EPR. And in the FSLabs A320 you can actually get a failure, what is called engine 1 EPR mode fault. In this example we have an engine 1 EPR mode fault on engine 1, and you can see that the EPR indicator for engine 1 has amber crosses now. However, the engine is still running and you do still have an N1 indication. However, at the present time you have no control over engine 1, meaning that if you move the thrust lever number 1, there's just simply no response. Now, in order to regain control over the thrust lever and the thrust control of the engine, you have to do the procedure and switch on the N1 mode, which is on the over panel. Once you do that, then you regain the control. And of course, in order to have the same mode for both engines, both N1 mode selectors are selected on. Also on the engine warning display you can see that N1 mode is now in use. And now you can set the thrust according to the N1 scale. However, be aware that the auto thrust system is not working anymore. Alright, so we come to the end of this video. I think I've covered the major differences between the two engine types. If there's anything else you would like to know about those engines, post a comment down below and I will answer them as quickly as I can. As always, thank you very much for watching, thank you very much for your awesome support, and I'll see you again in the next video. Until then, as always, happy landings.
$100, $50, $40, $30, $20, retard 10, 5.